There are some stories you were never meant to hear, some truths buried so deep that even the families who lived them swore they would take them to their graves, but diaries don't burn as easily as secrets, and blood never lies. Tonight's story is one of those truths, the kind whispered in small towns, hidden in plain sight and erased from history books, a story of a father and the baby that should never have existed. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now picture this. A quiet American town in the 1940s. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, church bells echoing every Sunday. From the outside, life looked perfect. Families posed for photographs, children played in yards, and fathers tipped their hats as they passed by. But beneath the surface, one family carried a secret so dark it could never be spoken aloud. It began with trust, something every daughter places in her father. But trust can be twisted, and when it is violated, the wound it leaves behind festers like poison, infecting not just one generation, but every life that comes after. Hidden in a locked drawer, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was the diary that told the truth. Ordinary entries about weather and harvests, tucked around lines of horror so shocking they hardly seemed real. Pages that revealed how a respected man had broken every boundary, every sacred law of family and blood. Neighbors noticed the tension but never asked. Children grew up under the weight of an unspoken shadow. And the town, bound together by silence, pretended nothing was wrong. But the eyes in the family portraits told another story. Eyes filled with shame, fear, and a truth they couldn't erase. And at the center of it all, there was a babe. A baby who should never have been born. A baby who carried both the innocence of new life and the mark of one of the darkest family secrets in American history. The house where it all happened still stands today, though most who pass by have no idea what walls can remember. Weathered paint, sagging porch steps, and a window that never seems to catch the light. Families have moved in and out, children have played in the yard, but the structure itself has kept silent vigil over a past too monstrous to name. Back then, in the years before the truth was known, the father was admired. He was the kind of man people turned to for advice, the kind of man who shook hands with authority in town and bowed his head in church on Sundays. To his neighbors, he was a model of discipline and strength. To his family, he was the provider, the protector. But as history has taught us again and again, appearances are the cruelest liars. His daughter, the one who should have been safe in his care, was instead trapped in a web she could never escape. At first, the signs were invisible. A girl who seemed quiet, a little too withdrawn, eyes that never lingered long on her father's face when company was around. The kind of details you only notice when you know what to look for. But in those days, no one looked. And those who suspected chose silence. Silence. That was the key. In small towns, silence is the mortar that holds reputations together. Everyone knew their place. You didn't ask questions about what went on behind closed doors. You didn't repeat rumors unless you wanted trouble. And so the daughter carried her burden alone, even as it grew heavier, even as it threatened to break her from the inside out. The truth only began to surface when her body could no longer hide the evidence. A swelling belly, explained away with lies about illness, about weight, about anything but the unthinkable. The neighbors nodded, the church prayed, and the family closed ranks around their secret. A daughter, carrying not just shame, but life itself. Life created in the most forbidden way imaginable. And from that moment forward, the line between father and protector, father and destroyer, was erased forever. The child that grew inside her was both innocent and damned, born of bloodlines that should never have crossed, and though the world outside pretended nothing had changed, inside that house, nothing would ever be the same again. By the time the baby was born, the story had already begun to twist into something even darker. Neighbors noticed the child, of course. In a town that small, a new face was impossible to hide. But questions about the father were quickly shut down, replaced with carefully rehearsed answers. Some were told it was the child of a distant cousin. Others believed the girl had been taken advantage of by a stranger passing through. Everyone had a version of the truth that was easier to swallow than the reality. The father himself made certain of it. His authority, his stern gaze, his reputation in the community, it was enough to silence even the boldest tongues. People may have whispered behind curtains, but no one dared to confront him. In that silence, the story he wanted the world to believe took root, and the actual truth, the unbearable truth, was left to rot in the shadows of that home. The daughter, now both mother and victim, carried herself with a quiet despair. She did not smile in photographs. She avoided gatherings, choosing instead to stay close to the child, as though protecting it from the very man who had created it, yet at the same time she could not protect herself. The chains of silence bound her as tightly as any locked door. What makes this story so chilling is not just what happened, it is how completely everyone chose to pretend it hadn't. The town itself became a co-conspirator, each person deciding that comfort was worth more than truth. A minister who looked the other way, a doctor who signed off on false records, relatives who avoided visiting because they couldn't bear the weight of what they suspected. They didn't save her, they didn't save the child, they only saved themselves from having to admit the evil in their midst. And that child, her father's baby, grew up not knowing where he belonged. Was he a son, a grandson, a brother, or something else? Entirely. The very fact of his existence was a question no one wanted to answer. He was living proof of everything that should never have happened. Proof that shame and silence cannot erase what blood makes permanent. The photographs from those years, if you study them closely, reveal the truth in the eyes. Eyes that never meet the camera, eyes filled with secrets no child should carry. And in those eyes, you can almost see the curse of inheritance, the sense that some sins are not just committed, but passed down. As the years went on, the walls of that house seemed to hold their breath. The father continued to walk through town with the same steady stride, tipping his hat, shaking hands, and receiving nods of respect. To anyone who didn't look too closely, nothing appeared out of place. But behind the curtains, behind the wooden doors, the secret festered like a wound that refused to heal. The daughter, now a mother trapped by circumstance, aged quickly. Witnesses from the time recalled how her face carried a weariness beyond her years, how her shoulders always seemed to sag, as though bearing a weight no one else could see. Some said she had moments of rebellion, whispers that she once considered leaving, taking the baby and running far away. But in a small town, running wasn't freedom, it was scandal, and scandal was often punished more harshly than crime itself. So she stayed, bound by shame, bound by fear, and bound by a father who had turned protector into predator. And what of the child? In small communities, children carry the burden of their parents' reputations. Playground taunts, cold shoulders in classrooms, subtle exclusions that never needed words. Though no one dared speak the truth openly, children have a way of repeating what they overhear. That boy doesn't have a real father. That family's cursed. Rumors took root in the soil, sprouting in cruel whispers that followed the child through every stage of his young life. But perhaps the cruelest part was how well the family kept up appearances. Sunday dinners continued, photographs were still taken, holidays were observed, and in every picture, every gathering, the father remained at the center, as though nothing at all was amiss. It is here that history becomes most disturbing, because it shows us how deeply humans can bury horror beneath ritual. The very rituals meant to represent unity, meals, church, community, were used as camouflage for an unspeakable crime. What the town refused to admit out loud, the house itself seemed to scream. Visitors spoke of a heaviness in the air, of shadows that lingered in corners too long, of doors that creaked when no one touched them. Maybe it was imagination, maybe it was guilt, but everyone who entered that house walked away with the same uneasy feeling that the walls themselves remembered. And in that memory was the truth no one dared to face. The truth of a family fractured by its own patriarch. A truth bound in silence, yet destined to resurface. Secrets have a strange way of seeping out, no matter how carefully they are buried. For years, the family did everything they could to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But illusions are fragile things. A careless word, a misinterpreted glance, a slip of the tongue. These tiny fractures in the facade began to multiply, and slowly the truth started bleeding into the open. Relatives who visited noticed the strange dynamic in the household. The father's overbearing presence, the daughter's tense silence, and the child's confused place within it all. Some whispered among themselves after they left, suggesting that something wasn't right. But those whispers never grew into action. They returned to their own homes, carrying with them the comfort of distance. It was easier to wonder in silence than to confront the horror head-on. The daughter's health began to fail. Years of internal torment and the crushing weight of secrecy carved away at her strength. There are stories of her staring out of the upstairs window for hours, watching the road as though waiting for someone, anyone, to come and rescue her. But no one did. Perhaps she hoped the truth would one day be revealed, that the weight she carried would finally be lifted. Instead, the silence became her coffin long before the earth claimed her body. And the child? He grew into an uneasy adolescence, never fully understanding why the air around him seemed charged with something he couldn't name. Teachers described him as withdrawn, quick to anger, suspicious of kindness. Other children mocked him for reasons they didn't even fully grasp. He carried a mark he could not see, but everyone else seemed to recognize. It wasn't his fault. It was never his fault. But blood ties are merciless, and the sins of the father wrapped around his young shoulders like chains. The townspeople, too, bore their share of the burden. Each smile, each handshake, each polite nod exchanged with the father was an act of complicity. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. Generations later, when outsiders would ask about the family, older residents would grow quiet. Their eyes would flicker with something unspoken, a shadow of the shame they had inherited simply by living in the same place. And so the secret, though never confessed, became something larger than the family. It became a stain on the town itself, a story everyone knew, but no one would speak, a curse that lingered in silence, waiting for the day it could no longer be ignored. Time has a way of wearing down even the strongest walls of silence. What was once carefully hidden in whispers and diaries began to unravel as the decades passed. Pieces of the truth, tiny fragments at first, surfaced in places no one expected. A note tucked between pages of an old Bible, a slip of paper left in a drawer, hospital records that didn't match the family's story. The past was bleeding back into the present, and with it came a sense of dread. The child, now grown, lived a life marked by confusion and fractured identity. To the world, he was just another man trying to find his place. But inside, questions gnawed at him. Who am I really? What am I to this family? He was both a brother and a son, both grandson and child. His very existence was a paradox, a puzzle no one wanted to solve. And when he sought answers, he was met with the same silence that had defined his entire life. But silence cannot outlast truth. Diaries began to surface after deaths in the family. Words written in shaky hands, words never meant to be read, now stood as testimony. They spoke of betrayal, of coercion, of nights filled with terror, and between the lines was the story no one dared speak aloud, a father who had crossed the boundary that should never be crossed, and the baby born from that forbidden act. By then, most of the original players in the tragedy had gone to their graves. But the story they left behind was not dead. It lived on in the bloodline, in the community, in the unease that haunted anyone who got too close to the truth. And here, before we go further, I want to pause and ask you something. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you bury it to protect your family's name, or expose it no matter the cost? Because as we move deeper into this story, you'll see that The choice to reveal or to conceal is never simple. It's a choice that divides families, destroys legacies, and sometimes saves lives. The truth had been buried for decades, but it was finally starting to claw its way to the surface, and it was ready to drag the living down with it. The unraveling did not come all at once. Like the slow drip of water wearing down stone, the truth revealed itself piece by piece. A cousin who had always suspected finally spoke to her children before her death. An old photograph surfaced with names scribbled on the back. Names that didn't match the family's official story. And when a curious relative sent away for a DNA test decades later, the results confirmed what had once been dismissed as rumor. The bloodline itself exposed the crime. No diary, no rumor, no whispered story could be denied once the science was laid bare. The child, long grown into a man, was both son and grandson. His lineage folded in on itself like a hall of mirrors, trapping him in an identity that defied language. And for the living descendants it forced a choice: continue the silence or finally acknowledge the shadow at the center of their family tree. For some, acknowledgement was impossible. To speak it aloud was to unravel their own sense of self, their own place in the world. They clung to denial, to anger, to the old defense that the past should be left buried. But others, those who had inherited only fragments of the story, felt an undeniable pull to uncover everything, to shine a light into the darkest corners, no matter how painful it might be. It was these descendants who began digging through archives, searching through courthouse records, piecing together the story that the town had tried to erase. They found birth certificates filed under false names, discrepancies in church ledgers, and medical records with dates that made no sense. Each discovery was like pulling back another layer of rot, and behind every layer was a deeper wound. The town itself resisted. Long-time residents refused interviews. Some became angry when asked about the family, shutting doors, changing the subject. It was as though speaking the truth aloud would curse them too. But their silence was telling. It confirmed what the records already showed, that the town had always known and had chosen complicity over confrontation. And so the story no longer belonged only to the past. It was alive in the present, demanding to be acknowledged. The dead could not speak for themselves, but the evidence they left behind made their silence thunder louder than words ever could. The secret was no longer hidden. It was standing in plain sight, staring back through the generations, waiting to be named. The most disturbing part of this story isn't only what happened in that house, it's what it did to the minds of those who lived with it. Trauma has a way of reshaping memory, bending it, twisting it, until even the victims doubt their own reality. And for the daughter who bore her father's child, that torment was endless. She lived between two worlds, the public mask of obedience and respectability, and the private hell of knowing the man who should have protected her had destroyed her. Her diary entries, the ones recovered years later, reveal a chilling duality. In one line, she writes about cooking supper, about the weather, about the mundane details of daily life. But between those lines, in handwriting that grows more frantic, she records nights of terror, the sound of footsteps in the hall, the crushing weight of silence. It's as if two versions of her existed, the one the world saw, and the one who screamed silently on the page. The child, too, bore the mark of that silence. Growing up, he felt the weight of an invisible stigma. The community's sideways glances, the schoolyard whispers, the unexplained hostility. He absorbed it all without ever being told why. His identity was a puzzle with missing pieces, and each missing piece was a reminder that something vital was being hidden from him. Children can sense lies, even if they cannot name them, and he sensed it every day of his life. The psychological toll spread outward, touching even those who weren't directly involved. Siblings who pretended not to notice, a mother who looked away rather than confront the man she married, cousins who wondered why family gatherings always carried a tension that never quite lifted. The silence didn't just protect the guilty, it infected the innocent, teaching them to doubt, to suppress, to keep secrets of their own. This is how family trauma becomes generational. It is not confined to one act, or one victim, or one generation. It ripples outward, shaping behaviors, planting seeds of fear, mistrust, and shame that sprout decades later in ways no one can fully explain. What happened in that house was not just one man's crime, it was a poison that seeped into the very bloodline, staining everyone it touched. And as we continue this story, you'll see how that poison did not stay hidden, because even the deepest wounds, the ones no one dares to name, will eventually surface. By the time grandchildren came into the picture, the original crime had already faded into half-remembered whispers. But trauma doesn't need words to survive. It passes through silences, through nervous glances, through the unspoken rules that shape a family's life. The descendants of that house grew up with shadows they could not name. They inherited mistrust without knowing why. They learned to keep quiet before they ever understood what it was they weren't supposed to say. Family photographs from those years tell a haunting story. Children with stiff smiles, mothers with vacant eyes, fathers standing just a little too far or a little too close. If you didn't know the truth, you'd miss it. But once you do, the unease leaps out. Every image becomes a clue, every gesture a crack in the facade. It was in this generation that the first real cracks of rebellion began to show. Some refused to attend family gatherings. Others left town entirely, carrying with them the feeling that home was not safe, though they could not explain why. And when questions were asked, the answers were vague. Don't bring it up. We don't talk about that. Some things are better left in the past. The very avoidance of the topic confirmed its existence. Meanwhile, outsiders who married into the family often felt the tension most acutely. They described a heaviness in the air during visits, the sense that something was always lurking beneath polite conversation. Some of them pressed harder for answers, only to be met with cold silence or outright hostility. The family had become skilled at deflection. The silence was not just a habit anymore, it was a fortress. But the younger generation, raised in a different world, began to see the fortress for what it was. They were not bound by the same codes of loyalty, the same fear of scandal. They asked louder questions, and when answers didn't come, they turned to the evidence. Old letters, courthouse archives, DNA results. And what they found confirmed what had once been dismissed as rumor. The secret was no longer a whisper. It had become a documented fact. The family could no longer deny it. The town could no longer bury it. And with the truth finally in the open, the question shifted. What happens to a family when the darkest thing they ever did is revealed for all to see? When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive with a single revelation, but with a storm. Documents, diaries, and DNA results began to circulate among family members, tearing apart the fragile web of silence that had held for so long. Relatives who had once denied everything now found themselves staring at evidence they could not explain away. And with each revelation came a wave of anger, shame, and disbelief. Some members of the family broke down completely, insisting the truth was too painful to bear. They claimed the records were wrong, the diaries forged, the memories exaggerated. Others reacted with fury, not at the crime itself, but at the fact that it was finally being exposed. For them, the secret had become part of their survival, a dark foundation they had built their lives upon. To admit it now was to unravel not just history, but identity. The town, too, was shaken. For years it had been a place of complicity, where neighbors pretended not to know, but the exposure of the truth forced everyone to face their role in keeping silent. Ministers who had once prayed over the family, teachers who had looked the other way, doctors who had signed false records. Each was revealed, if not by name, then by association. The silence that had once protected them was now a condemnation. For the descendants, the experience was shattering. To know that your grandfather, your father, your blood had committed an act so monstrous, it reshapes everything. Holidays feel different, family names lose their meaning, and even your reflection feels like a stranger's. Some chose to cut ties completely, refusing to carry the family name forward. Others decided to confront it head-on, turning the story into a warning for future generations. But exposure did not bring healing overnight. It rarely does. Instead, it unleashed years of suppressed grief, rage, and confusion. Arguments. Split siblings apart. Cousins refused to speak to one another. The family fractured along lines of denial and acceptance, some still insisting the past should remain buried, while others demanded that silence had already done enough damage. The curse of the secret was finally broken, but the cost of truth was devastating. The family was no longer united in silence. They were shattered by revelation. And yet, for the first time in generations, the truth itself stood in the open, undeniable, and unforgotten. In the years that followed the revelation, the family became something of a cautionary tale. Outsiders who learned the story were horrified, while insiders wrestled with the pieces of their shattered legacy. Some tried to distance themselves entirely, moving far away, changing their names, cutting ties with the bloodline that carried so much shame. Others, however, felt compelled to stay, to bear witness, as though abandoning the story would mean letting the silence win again. The town itself, though never formally acknowledging its complicity, carried the weight in more subtle ways. Residents spoke of a dark chapter without naming it, a kind of cultural amnesia that left younger generations asking questions their elders refused to answer. The house where it all began was eventually sold, then resold, its reputation whispered about but never publicly stated. People avoided walking past it at night. Some swore they heard sounds in the halls, footsteps, muffled cries, doors closing when no one was inside. Perhaps it was only the power of suggestion, but perhaps it was something more, the residue of a crime so heavy it clung to the very walls. The descendants who chose to confront the truth began to piece together a fuller picture. Through interviews, archives, and those fading diaries, they stitched the narrative back together, not to glorify it, but to ensure it could not be erased again. They spoke of the psychological scars, the way silence had metastasized into every corner of their family tree. And by speaking it aloud, they hoped to end the cycle, to free the next generation from carrying the same poisoned inheritance. Yet the question lingered. Can a family ever be free from something like this? Can a community ever wash away the stain of knowing and doing nothing? The truth was now exposed, undeniable, etched into records that could not be burned or rewritten. But truth alone does not heal. It only illuminates. Healing requires something far more difficult: acceptance, confrontation, forgiveness where possible, and accountability where it is not. And so the story endures, not just as a family tragedy, not just as a crime, but as a mirror held up to anyone who has ever kept silent to preserve comfort. A mirror that asks, what would you have done if the monster lived under your own roof, wearing the face of someone you loved? The story of her father's baby is not simply a tale of one family in one forgotten town. It is something larger, something that forces us to look at the darkest corners of human nature and the terrifying power of silence. Because what happened there could happen anywhere. All it requires is a community willing to look the other way, and a family willing to bury the truth in the name of reputation. The diaries, the records, the whispers, they all converge into one undeniable fact. A man entrusted with protecting his family destroyed it from within. A daughter was silenced. A child was born carrying a mark he never asked for. And generations afterward carried scars they could not name. This is not just history. It is inheritance. It is a curse passed down, not by blood alone, but by silence. When we uncover stories like this, they do more than disturb us. They remind us of the fragility of trust, of the ease with which evil hides behind ordinary faces. The smiling patriarch, the polite neighbor, the respected churchgoer. How many other towns, how many other families carry secrets just as dark, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them out? As we close this story, remember, the past never truly disappears. It lingers in photographs, in diaries, in the haunted eyes of those who lived through it. The silence of one generation becomes the nightmare of the next, and every time we choose not to speak, we build another wall around the truth. You were never meant to hear this story. That's why it was buried, that's why it was erased, but now you have, and knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. So I leave you with this question. What secrets lie buried in your own family, your own town, hidden beneath polite smiles and well-kept lawns? And if you found them, would you be brave enough to speak them aloud? This has been Her Father's Baby, the darkest family secret in Sage story. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so more people can confront the shadows of the past, because only by facing them can we prevent them from being repeated.